Imagine marching all day beneath a blistering sun, your body weighed down by armor, weapons, and supplies, your feet sore from endless miles of dust and stone. By nightfall, your muscles ache, your stomach growls, and your mind longs for rest. But rest for an ancient soldier was never guaranteed. Instead of soft mattresses and warm blankets, they often faced the cold earth, the damp of the night, and the uncertainty of sudden attack. Sleep, when it came, was not just a comfort, it was a fragile shield against exhaustion, a necessity for survival in the brutal life of war. Tonight, we will journey back in time and uncover what it was like for soldiers of long ago to find sleep while on campaign. From the Roman legions to medieval knights, from the armies of Alexander the Great to the warriors of distant empires, we will explore how they made camp, what they slept on, how they stayed safe through the night, and what dreams, if any, they might have found amidst the chaos of war. As you listen, let yourself drift with their struggles and small victories. Picture the flicker of campfires, the quiet murmurs of comrades before silence settled, and the simple comfort soldiers created to make the hard ground bearable. This isn't just history. It is a way to step into their world and let the rhythm of the past help ease your thoughts into rest. Before we begin, I invite you to take a moment to subscribe to this channel, History for Sleep. Here, we bring the past alive in calm, thoughtful detail, so that you can both learn and relax. Subscribing helps us create more of these long, soothing journeys into history, and it ensures you'll always have something gentle and fascinating to fall asleep to. And if you feel inspired, leave a comment below. Tell us what parts of history interest you most, or even when you like to listen, whether it's at night to unwind or during the day for a moment of peace. Your thoughts help guide the stories we share. So now, settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let us begin with the world of ancient soldiers and the way they found rest in the most unlikely of places. No matter the time period or the culture, one thing bound all soldiers together: the struggle to find rest in a world that rarely allowed for it. The human body, no matter how strong, cannot endure without sleep, and yet war is perhaps the most unforgiving environment for something as vulnerable as closing one's eyes. Imagine yourself as an ancient soldier, standing at the edge of a battlefield as dusk approaches. The sun lowers, casting long shadows across the earth, and you feel the weight of the day settle into your bones. The march has been long, the pack on your back heavy, the clamor of orders and the clash of practice drills echoing in your ears. The promise of night brings the faint possibility of sleep, but also the constant anxiety that danger could strike at any moment. For soldiers of antiquity, sleep was not a luxury. It was a fragile necessity snatched from the jaws of exhaustion. Unlike the civilian world, where rest might be enjoyed within the safety of a home or the security of familiar surroundings, the soldier had no such guarantee. His bed could be the cold ground of a foreign plain, the damp soil of a forest clearing, or the bare planks of a hastily built wooden platform. His pillow might be a rolled-up cloak or his own arm, and his blanket no more than the sky above. And yet, despite these discomforts, the body demanded rest, and the soldier had to find a way to answer that call. The universality of this struggle can be seen across cultures and centuries. A Roman legionary on campaign in Gaul faced the same essential challenge as a Chinese soldier serving the Han dynasty on the edge of the empire. A Greek hoplite marching with Alexander's army endured the same nightly battle for comfort as a Viking raider crossing into foreign lands. The details of their equipment, their training, and their culture differed, but when night came and the fires burned, lo, they all shared the same human need: to close their eyes, slow their breathing, and surrender for a few short hours to the quiet rhythm of sleep. But sleep is never simple in times of war. The soldier's mind, no matter how weary, was often restless with thoughts of what might come with the morning. For some, the memory of past battles haunted them, images of friends lost and sounds of dying cries replaying in their minds as they tried to drift away. For others, anticipation of the next fight filled their chest with unease. Would they live through tomorrow's clash? Would their body survive another day of strain and violence? This psychological burden meant that even when a soldier could lie down, he did not always find true rest. There was also the issue of danger itself. An army on campaign was never completely safe, and so watches had to be kept throughout the night. Soldiers often slept in shifts, some lying down while others kept alert eyes on the horizon, listening for the snap of a twig or the rustle of movement that might signal an enemy attack. In some armies, strict systems of guard duty ensured that no soldier slept undisturbed for more than a few hours before being shaken awake to take his turn on watch. This constant interruption made sleep lighter, less restful, and far shorter than the body truly needed. The result was an ongoing cycle of fatigue, endured by men who had no choice but to adapt. Yet there were moments of reprieve, small victories in the nightly war for comfort. Soldiers learned tricks to ease their rest. A rolled-up cloak beneath the head, a patch of dry grass for bedding, the warmth of comrades lying close together against the chill. These small adjustments made the difference between a night of tossing and turning and a few hours of genuine sleep. Some cultures even developed traditions around these nightly routines. For example, Roman soldiers became skilled at constructing temporary camps that gave some protection from the elements and a sense of order that reassured the weary mind. In other societies, the simple act of lighting a fire and gathering near it brought both warmth and psychological comfort, a real sense of safety in the darkness. The universality of the struggle is clear not only in physical accounts, but also in the language of ancient writers. Historians, poets, and commanders often noted the exhaustion of their men, describing the way soldiers collapsed onto the earth at day's end, too weary to care about their surroundings. In these writings, sleep appears again and again as both a blessing and a curse, a relief from pain and toil, but also a vulnerability, for to sleep was to surrender awareness, to leave oneself exposed in a world where death could strike without warning. Even dreams played a role in this universal experience. For soldiers, dreams were not always restful. Ancient cultures often believed that dreams carried meaning, sometimes divine messages about the future. A soldier who dreamed of battle the night before a fight might awaken in fear, convinced that the gods had sent him a warning. Others dreamed of home, of family, of comfort and warmth, only to awaken to the harsh reality of a muddy field or a crowded tent. These contrasts made the act of sleep bittersweet, both an escape and a reminder of what was absent. Despite all of this, soldiers endured. They learned to live on less sleep than they might have had in civilian life, to rest in bursts rather than long stretches, and to accept discomfort as part of the profession. This endurance is perhaps the most striking universal feature of the soldier's nightly life, the ability to adapt, to close one's eyes even on the hard ground, to find rest even with danger looming nearby. It is a testament to human resilience that in the harshest conditions, soldiers still manage to sleep enough to continue marching, fighting, and surviving. When we think of ancient warfare, we often picture battles, marches, and strategies. But it is worth remembering that behind every clash of armies lay countless nights of this quiet, persistent struggle. For every heroic charge or legendary victory, there were endless hours of soldiers lying awake under the stars, shifting on the ground, listening to the night, and hoping for a few moments of peace. And in those moments, they were not so different from us. The act of seeking sleep, the desire for rest after a long day, is a deeply human experience, shared across all of history. As we move deeper into this journey, we will see how different cultures and armies approach the problem in their own ways. Some found structure and discipline to provide security, while others relied on adaptability and endurance. Some placed faith in the gods to watch over them as they slept, while others trusted only the watchful eyes of their comrades. But in every case, the soldier as nightly struggle reminds us of the universal bond between past and present, the simple, enduring need to close our eyes and rest, no matter the world around us. When we think of Roman soldiers, what often comes to mind are images of disciplined lines, gleaming armor, and the clash of swords and shields on battlefields that stretched across continents. Yet, as much as the Roman legions were defined by their skill in combat, they were equally defined by their routines off the battlefield, especially at night. The Roman army was not just an armed force. It was a moving machine of discipline, order, and meticulous organization. Nowhere is this clearer than in the way they built their camps and how they arranged their rest. For a Roman soldier, sleep was not simply falling wherever exhaustion took him. It was part of a carefully managed system that reflected the core values of the Roman military. At the end of a march, the first priority was not to collapse on the ground, no matter how weary the soldiers were. Instead, orders were given to construct a camp and act repeated so often that it became second nature to the legionaries. No matter where the army found itself, be it in Gaul, Germania, North Africa, or the Near East, the procedure was almost identical. The chosen ground was surveyed, boundaries marked, and a rectangular fortification laid out with mathematical precision. Trenches were dug, earth piled into ramparts, and wooden stakes set to create a defensive perimeter. Inside, the space was divided into streets and designated areas for tents, supplies, and command centers. This act of camp building had many purposes. It created safety, both physically and psychologically. A soldier lying down inside the camp knew that barriers stood between him and the darkness beyond. Guards were posted at regular intervals, ensuring that not all men slept at once. The orderliness of the camp, with its streets and plots laid out the same way every time, provided comfort through familiarity. Even hundreds of miles from home, in foreign lands filled with unknown dangers, a Roman soldier could settle into a camp that looked and felt almost identical to the one before. For sleep, the legionary relied on his leather tent, usually shared with 7 or 8 comrades from his contubernum, the smallest unit of the Roman army. These men marched together, ate together, and when night came, they slept together. The tent was supported by wooden poles and covered with hides, offering some shelter against wind and rain, but often feeling cramped and smoky if a small fire or lamp was lit inside. The ground beneath was rarely forgiving, so soldiers spread cloaks or straw to soften the earth. Armor was set nearby, ready to be donned at the first alarm, while weapons never strayed far from reach. This close arrangement of comrades was not just a matter of practicality. It was a bond. Sharing the same small space meant that men became intimately familiar with each other's habits, moods, and even snores. If one stirred in the night, others would notice. If one had a nightmare, his fellows might murmur reassurances. These tents became small havens of brotherhood within the larger machinery of the legion, and though comfort was sparse, the presence of companions brought a measure of reassurance. But even within the safety of the camp, sleep was managed with discipline. Guards rotated through the night in organized watches. The Roman system divided the dark hours into 4 segments, with fresh sentries replacing the tired ones in steady cycles. A soldier could not simply sleep through the night without risk of being shaken awake for duty. While this disrupted the possibility of long, unbroken rest, it also gave soldiers confidence that someone was always vigilant. Few armies in the ancient world achieved this balance of vigilance and rest as systematically as the Romans. The officers, of course, had better arrangements. A centurion might sleep in a larger tent, sometimes with a bedroll raised above the ground. Higher commanders enjoyed still more luxury, with separate quarters, furniture, and servants to attend them. But even generals, such as Julius Caesar, were known for their ability to endure the same hardships as their men. Ancient accounts describe Caesar sleeping on the ground, alongside his soldiers when the situation demanded it, a practice that earned him their loyalty and admiration. Despite the structure, Roman soldiers still faced the same discomforts that plagued all armies. Rain could soak through the leather tents, cold winds cut through cloaks, and insects swarmed in the night. On long campaigns, bedding wore thin, cloaks tore, and straw grew moldy. Disease often crept into camps, spreading through close quarters and making nights restless with coughing and fever. For all their organization, the Romans could not completely escape the harshness of sleeping in the field. Yet the genius of the Roman system was in its consistency. By turning the act of camping into ritual, they gave their soldiers something to hold on to, something reliable in the uncertainty of war. To march into unknown territory and end the day with a familiar camp was to create a rhythm that calmed the mind. Even if the ground was hard and the air chill, the order and safety of the camp allowed the soldier to find rest more easily than if he were left exposed. One can imagine the end of such a day: the trenches dug, the stakes hammered, the tents raised, and the fires lit. Soldiers huddled together, their stomachs filled with bread, porridge, or whatever rations could be spared. The murmur of conversation filled the camp, gradually quieting as men rolled into their cloaks. Outside the perimeter, guards kept watch, their eyes on the darkness. Inside, the legionaries surrendered, if only for a few hours, to the pull of sleep. The Roman approach to camp life is a reminder that sleep was not just a personal matter, but a collective one. It was protected by fortifications, enforced by routine, and shared among comrades. This mixture of discipline and camaraderie is what allowed the Roman legions to sustain themselves through campaigns that lasted years, conquering and holding lands far from home. And at the heart of it all, under the canvas of their leather tents, were ordinary men closing their eyes, breathing deeply, and trying to find the strength for whatever the next dawn would bring. The life of a Greek hoplite or a Macedonian soldier under Alexander the Great was a life marked by endurance, discipline, and relentless marching across vast landscapes. Yet when the sun set and the clamor of the day gave way to the quiet of night, these men faced the same question as every soldier in history: where and how to sleep. For Greek soldiers, rest was as much a part of their campaign as the clash of spears, and shields, though it was often stolen in brief, imperfect moments rather than enjoyed in comfort. The Greek hoplite, a heavily armed infantryman, carried not only his spear and shield, but also his armor and provisions. On campaign, this burden could weigh heavily on his body, and by the end of a long march, exhaustion often dictated the night's arrangements. Unlike the Romans, the Greeks did not always build fortified camps with mathematical precision, though they sometimes constructed palisades or trenches when danger loomed. More often, they relied on choosing favorable ground and elevated position if possible, with access to water and enough open space for the phalanx to reform at dawn if needed. Once the ground was chosen, men spread out across the area in groups, their shields and cloaks serving as both bedding and protection. The shield, or hoplon, was more than just a tool of war. It became part of the soldier's nightly rest. A hoplite might place his shield at his side, ready to grasp in an instant, or use it as a partial windbreak. His cloak, called the chlamys, doubled as his blanket, wrapped tightly against the night air. In summer, the nights could be mild, but in colder seasons, the thin wool provided little relief. The ground beneath was often bare earth, softened only by grass if fortune allowed. Some soldiers carried small mats of woven reeds, but these were luxuries, quickly worn out in the grind of long campaigns. When Alexander the Great led his Macedonian phalanx eastward, the problem of sleep became even more pronounced. His armies marched thousands of miles through Asia Minor, across deserts, mountains, and river valleys. Each day brought new terrain and new trials. Soldiers often collapsed from exhaustion at day's end, their bodies pushed beyond the limits of ordinary endurance. The pace of Alexander's campaigns left little time for elaborate camps. Tents were rare, except for officers and high-ranking individuals. Most soldiers slept beneath the stars, cloaks wrapped tight, sometimes in pairs or small groups for warmth. In hostile lands, campfires dotted the night, both for light and as a psychological barrier against the unknown. The camaraderie of the Macedonian army was forged in these nightly routines. Comrades shared not only food, but also the small comforts that could make a difference in sleep. A soldier with extra straw might spread it for his companions. A man with a stronger cloak might lend it to one shivering beside him. These simple gestures built bonds of loyalty that proved essential in battle. In the shared vulnerability of sleep, men became more than fellow soldiers. They became brothers. Yet the Greeks and Macedonians were always aware of danger. Night watches were established, and men took turns guarding their resting comrades. In Alexander's campaigns, this vigilance was heightened, as the army often found itself deep in foreign territory, with enemies lurking in the darkness. Sleep was therefore fragmented. A soldier might rest for a few hours, be shaken awake to take his turn on guard, and then return to the ground for another short stretch of rest. The cycle left men perpetually tired, but the discipline of the phalanx and the leadership of their commanders carried them forward. Even in their exhaustion, the soldiers' minds were not free from unease. Ancient writers often describe soldiers dreaming of home, of wives and children left behind, only to awaken disoriented and surrounded by the smell of sweat, earth, and campfires. Others dreamed of battle, their minds replaying the violence of the day or anticipating the struggles to come. Some saw omens in these dreams, believing that the gods spoke to them in the quiet of the night. A dream of victory might lift spirits, while a nightmare of defeat could spread fear through the ranks. Alexander himself was known for his restless energy. Ancient accounts suggest that he often slept little, sometimes rising in the middle of the night to plan or confer with his officers. This habit filtered down to his men, who knew that their king demanded constant readiness. And yet he also shared in their hardships, sleeping on the same ground when circumstances required. His example reminded the army that even the greatest leaders were not above the nightly struggle for rest. The physical environment shaped these experiences in profound ways. In Greece, nights were often cool but manageable. In Asia Minor, soldiers contended with extreme sweltering days, followed by cold nights that bit through thin cloaks. Crossing into the Persian heartlands, the army endured deserts where the heat lingered long after sunset, making rest difficult on the burning sand. Later, in the mountains of Central Asia, icy winds cut into the soldiers' bodies as they tried to huddle together for warmth. In each new environment, sleep became a test of adaptability, a measure of how well the human body could endure. Despite these challenges, there were small moments of peace. After a hard march, when bellies were filled with simple rations, bread, cheese, onions, or dried meat, and the fires glowed in the dark, conversation flowed quietly among the men. Some told stories, others sang softly, and a few sat in silence, gazing at the stars. These rituals eased the transition into rest, a fragile bridge between the struggles of the day and the uncertainty of tomorrow. And when the fires burned low, when voices faded, and only the occasional cough or shifting body disturbed the quiet, the camp settled into uneasy sleep. In this way, Greek hoplites and Macedonian soldiers found rest in the midst of ceaseless campaigns. Their beds were the earth, their blankets thin, and their minds heavy with worry. Yet their resilience carried them through. Sleep, imperfect as it was, became another form of discipline, another battle to be endured for the sake of the greater struggle. And in their endurance, they joined the long chain of soldiers across history who learned that even in the harshest conditions, the body must rest, and the spirit must find moments of calm beneath the endless sky. Across the vast grasslands of Eurasia, where the horizon stretched endlessly, and the wind carried the scent of earth and horse. The nomadic warriors of the steppe carved out their lives. Unlike the Roman legionaries with their disciplined camps or the Macedonian phalanx bound by the strict march of empire, the steppe warriors lived in perpetual movement, their world shaped by the rhythm of their herds and the demands of survival. When it came to rest, these soldiers brought with them an entirely different relationship to the land, one born of centuries of adaptation to an unforgiving environment. For the Scythians, the Huns, the Mongols, and countless other steppe peoples, sleep was not a pause in the midst of war, but a continuation of the mobile life they had always known. The great advantage of the nomads was their familiarity with the open land. To them, the vast expanse was not a foreign place to be conquered, but a home they had always carried with them. When night fell, they did not need to build elaborate camps or survey the ground with military precision. Their tents, their herds, and their families were already a self-contained world. The yurt, that ingenious circular tent of felt stretched over wooden frames, was central to their nightly rest. Within its walls, the wind was kept at bay, warmth was preserved, and a sense of continuity was maintained no matter how far the army traveled. For those warriors fortunate enough to sleep within yurts, the experience was one of relative comfort compared to the exposed soldier of sedentary armies. Yet on campaign, not all could rely on yurts. When moving swiftly across hostile ground, or when the army stretched itself in raids deep into foreign territory, many warriors slept in the open, lying beneath cloaks or blankets of fur. Their horses, tethered nearby, were not only vital companions, but also guardians of rest. A nomadic soldier might lay his head close enough to hear the snorts and shifts of his mount, the sound reassuring him of safety. Horses provided warmth as well, their bodies radiating heat into the chill of the steppe night. For some, the bond was so strong that the soldier felt no unease resting on the ground if his horse stood nearby. The steppe night brought its own challenges. Winters were bitterly cold, the wind cutting without mercy, and soldiers often wrapped themselves in multiple layers of fur, huddling close to one another for warmth. In summer, the nights could be alive with insects, and rest was disturbed by the buzzing of flies and the itch of bites. Rainstorms swept across the plains with little warning, soaking bedding and chilling bodies. And yet, the nomads were masters of adaptation. They were accustomed to the discomforts of the land, and the ability to sleep in such conditions was as much a part of their training as archery or horsemanship. Security was managed differently than in more structured armies. Instead of rigid watches and fortified camps, nomadic armies relied on the fluidity of their movement and the vigilance of their scouts. Outriders patrolled the edges of the encampment, their horses swift enough to raise alarms at the first sign of danger. The openness of the land made it difficult for enemies to approach unseen, and this gave warriors a measure of confidence as they lay down to rest. Still, raids were always possible, and many slept lightly, ready to spring up at the faintest disturbance. Food and drink also shaped the nightly routine. Mare's milk, fermented into kumi, was a staple of the steppe and often consumed before rest. This mildly alcoholic drink warmed the body and calmed the mind, making it easier to drift into slumber despite the hardships of the day. Meat, dried or roasted over open fires, filled the belly and provided strength for the days ahead. The shared meal at night was not only nourishment, but also a bond, a reminder of unity before sleep scattered the warriors across the plain. Dreams held meaning for steppe peoples as well. Shamans often interpreted them, believing that spirits spoke through the visions of the night. A dream of horses running free might be taken as a sign of victory or speed, while a dream of shadowy figures could inspire caution. For the warrior himself, these dreams could offer comfort or unease, adding another layer of complexity to the act of sleep. Rest was never simply the closing of eyes. It was a moment when the spiritual and the physical worlds met. What is striking about the nomadic warrior asleep is how seamlessly it fit into the rhythm of their lives. Unlike the settled soldier, who might long for the comfort of a home or a familiar bed, the nomadic soldier already lived in motion. To lie on the grass beneath the stars was not an unnatural hardship, but an extension of the life he had always known. This adaptability gave them an edge on campaign, allowing them to endure long marches and harsh conditions without the collapse that might overcome less prepared armies. Imagine such a night, the stars blazing across the endless sky, the faint glow of fires scattered across the plain, the silhouettes of horses grazing in the distance. Warriors lie wrapped in cloaks, some within yurts, others in the open, their weapons close at hand. The air is cold, but the sound of companions breathing nearby offers reassurance. The steppe stretches out in silence, and for a few hours the warriors surrender to sleep, their bodies resting, their minds drifting between the earthly and the spiritual. Tomorrow they will rise, mount their horses, and continue the ceaseless flow of movement. But for now, the land itself cradles them. In this way, the nomadic warriors of the steppe carried with them a style of rest as unique as their way of war. For them, the night was not an interruption, but a continuation of the life they already lived, one of resilience, adaptability, and unity with the land. And as they closed their eyes beneath the vast sky, they joined the timeless struggle of all soldiers, to find peace in the midst of war, even if only for a fleeting moment. The deserts and river valleys of the ancient Near East produced some of the earliest great armies in human history, and with them, some of the earliest struggles over how to find rest while on campaign. The soldiers of Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria lived in worlds shaped by extremes: blistering days of sun, cool nights of desert winds, and the constant demand to march or prepare for war. For these men, the act of sleeping was never as simple as closing one's eyes. It was always bound up with the natural environment, the routines of their armies, and the ever-present uncertainties of conflict. The Egyptian soldier was often drawn from the farming population of the Nile Valley. His life at home was structured by the rhythm of the river, planting and harvesting with the floods. When called to campaign, however, he traded the fertile soil of the Nile for the harsh conditions of desert marshes. By day, the sun bore down relentlessly, sapping energy, drying throats, and leaving men drained by the time camp was called. By night, the temperatures fell, and the ground radiated the day's heat before chilling into coolness that crept through thin garments and mats. Soldiers often carried simple bedrolls of woven reeds or papyrus mats, which they unrolled directly onto the sand. Their cloaks or tunics doubled as coverings, though many relied more on their comrades huddling nearby for warmth than on the thin fabric draped across their shoulders. Egyptian armies sometimes carried tents for higher-ranking officers, but for the common soldier, the sky was his ceiling. Stars stretched across the heavens, the same stars that had guided farmers, priests, and kings for centuries. To lie beneath them was both a comfort and a reminder of the vastness of the world beyond the soldier as immediate struggles. Fires lit at the edges of the camp provided light and warmth, though the flickering glow also drew insects that buzzed and bit through the still hours. Mesopotamian armies, especially those of the Assyrians, brought with them a different style of organization. Known for their ferocity and their ability to project power far from their homelands, the Assyrians marched with strict discipline. Their soldiers carried equipment for both battle and rest, including blankets of wool or felt. Unlike Egypt's desert marshes, campaigns in Mesopotamia often wound through river valleys, hills, and fertile plains. The air could be humid, the nights damp, and the ground muddy. Sleep in such conditions was never easy. Soldiers might seek higher ground or dig shallow ditches to divert water from their resting places, but comfort was always scarce. A blanket dampened by dew or rain was heavy and cold, and the soldier beneath it could only shift uneasily, waiting for the morning sun to dry his body and clothes. For both Egyptian and Mesopotamian soldiers, sleep was also a matter of ritual and belief. These were societies deeply connected to their gods, and soldiers often prayed before resting, seeking protection in their most vulnerable hours. In Egypt, amulets and charms were carried into battle and kept close at night, tiny guardians against both earthly and supernatural dangers. In Mesopotamia, dreams were considered messages from the gods, and a soldier might awaken troubled by a vision he believed foretold defeat, or heartened by one that promised victory. These beliefs gave sleep an added weight. It was not simply about physical restoration. It was a nightly encounter with the spiritual world. The officers of these armies, of course, lived differently. Pharaohs on campaign sometimes traveled with elaborate tents that imitated the splendor of palaces. These structures, supported by wooden poles and covered with cloth, were richly decorated, filled with cushions, rugs, and furniture. Generals and noblemen had similar arrangements, though on a smaller scale. While the common soldier stretched out on the ground beneath the stars, his leaders might recline on raised beds, the comforts of home brought to the battlefield. Yet even these men were not immune to the disruptions of war. The calls of sentries, the distant sounds of animals, or the sudden alarm of an enemy raid could break into their rest as easily as it did for the lowest soldier. The rivers of these lands also shaped how soldiers rested. Campaigns often followed the Nile, the Tigris, or the Euphrates, and water sources determined the placement of camps. Soldiers might bathe before lying down, washing away sweat and dust, or they might drink deeply to quench thirst before sleep. But rivers were also dangerous, home to insects carrying disease or creatures that lurked unseen. Sleeping too close to the banks could bring discomfort or worse, so armies balanced the need for water with the need for safety. Imagine a night in an Assyrian campaign. The soldiers, weary from marching and skirmishes, settle in a wide field. Fires burn low, casting faint light against the looming forms of chariots and siege engines. The ground is damp, the air cool. Soldiers lie side by side, their wool cloaks drawn tight, their weapons kept within arm's reach. They drift into sleep, interrupted by dreams of gods, families, or battle, while at the edges of the camp, sentries watch with spears and bows ready. In the distance, the soft murmur of the river carries on, a sound both soothing and ominous. Now picture an Egyptian army at rest after a long desert march. The sun has finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the sand to cool. Soldiers unroll their mats, spreading them across the hard ground. Some huddle close, sharing warmth. Others lie apart, staring at the constellations their priests knew so well. A few murmur prayers to Ra or to Osiris, asking for safe passage through the night and into the day ahead. The fires flicker against the endless dark, and the desert wind rustles through the silence. Slowly, exhaustion pulls the men down, their breaths steadying as they surrender to the night. In both Egypt and Mesopotamia, sleep on campaign was a fragile, uneven thing. It was shaped by the extremes of climate, by the closeness of comrades, and by the ever-present presence of gods in the minds of men. And yet, as in every army across the ages, these soldiers found a way to rest enough to rise again, to take up their weapons, and to march into whatever awaited them at dawn. As day faded into evening in the life of an ancient soldier, there were three elements that defined the night: food to replenish the body, fire to provide warmth and light, and the ever-present system of night watch to guard against surprise. These three aspects formed the rhythm of every campaign evening, dictating not only when soldiers would finally close their eyes, but also how deeply they might rest once they did. In the absence of comfortable bedding or sturdy roofs, these small rituals became a soldier's nightly companions, weaving together necessity and routine into the fragile fabric of rest. Food came first, for without it, exhaustion only deepened. Soldiers on campaign rarely dined in luxury. Their meals were often repetitive, simple, and limited by what they could carry or find along the way. Bread, porridge, dried meat, and legumes formed the base of most diets. For Roman legionaries, rations of grain were issued, and they ground it themselves into coarse flour to bake rough loaves or boil into a gruel. Greek hoplites might share onions, cheese, and olives. Steppe warriors ate dried horse meat softened in water or roasted over flames, while Egyptian soldiers drew strength from bread and beer. Though meager, these meals were treasured moments, a chance for men to sit together, chew slowly, and recover strength lost in marching and fighting. Eating was not simply sustenance. It was ritual, a reassurance that no matter how foreign the land or how uncertain the campaign, the body was still cared for. After eating came fire. The sight of flames piercing the darkness was a comfort shared across all cultures. Fire gave warmth on cold nights and dried damp clothing after a day of rain. Its glow created a fragile circle of safety, pushing back the unseen world beyond the camp. Soldiers would cluster around it, sharing stories, murmuring jokes, or simply watching the embers crackle in silence. For many, fire was a reminder of home, echoing the hearths they had left behind. The scent of smoke lingered in cloaks and hair, becoming part of the soldier's identity, a constant marker of nights spent on campaign. Yet fire was not only a comfort, it was also a risk. Too much light might reveal the army's positioned enemies lurking in the distance. Too much smoke might carry sense across the land. Commanders had to weigh the need for warmth and morale against the danger of drawing unwanted attention. Some armies restricted fires to shielded parts of camp, while others permitted only small flames scattered thinly across the perimeter. Even in its risk, however, fire was rarely abandoned, for without it, the darkness pressed too heavily, and the soldier's mind could not easily rest. Then came the watch. No army could afford to sleep unguarded. The night, with its silence and concealment, was the perfect time for raids, ambushes, and infiltration. For this reason, soldiers were divided into watches, each man assigned his time to patrol, guard, or sit alert by the camp's edges. In Roman legions, the night was divided into 4 watches, and the steady rhythm of horns and signals marked the changing of the guard. In Greek and Macedonian armies, similar divisions were enforced, with men taking turns to ensure that no hour passed without vigilance. Steppe warriors, accustomed to the vast open land, relied on scouts and mounted patrols who could quickly rouse the camp if trouble approached. For those not on duty, the knowledge that comrades were watching was both a comfort and a disruption. Sleep was easier knowing someone stood guard, yet it was often broken when the turn of duty arrived. Soldiers might be shaken awake after only a short rest, their eyes heavy, bodies aching, and minds clouded with weariness. They would rise reluctantly, clutching spears or bows, and take their place in the night. The hours on watch passed slowly, filled with the rustle of wind, the distant calls of animals, and the ever-present fear that something unseen might emerge from the dark. When their turn ended, they returned to their bedrolls, trying to salvage what little rest remained before dawn. The interplay of food, fire, and night watch shaped not only the quality of a soldier's sleep, but also his emotional state. A full stomach eased anxieties, fire's glow comforted the spirit, and the knowledge of a watch reassured the heart. Together, these elements created a fragile space for rest amidst the uncertainty of war. Yet they also ensured that sleep was never entirely peaceful, never free of interruption or unease. The belly might still ache from hunger if rations ran low, the fire might sputter and fade, and the call of the watch might tear a man from his dreams before his body was ready. Imagine the scene. The army has finished marching, the camp set, and the soldiers gather for their meal. The sun dips below the horizon, and the first stars appear. Fires spark into life, glowing across the camp like scattered constellations on the earth. Men sit shoulder to shoulder, eating slowly, murmuring to one another, some laughing, others silent. The flames dance against tired faces, shadows flickering across leather and iron. Beyond the circle of light, the darkness stretches, vast and unknowable. Soon, orders are given, and the first watch begins. Some men lie down, wrapping cloaks around their bodies, while others rise reluctantly, gripping weapons and stepping into the night. The rhythm of the camp settles, the soft murmur of voices, the occasional crackle of fire, the slow breathing of weary men, and the steady footsteps of those on guard. This was the nightly balance every ancient soldier knew. Sustenance to strengthen the body, fire to warm the spirit, and vigilance to protect the sleeping. It was a fragile balance, and yet it was enough. For when dawn broke, the soldiers would rise, pack away what little comfort they had enjoyed, and march again into the trials of another day. When we imagine the soldier's bed, it is tempting to think of something at least resembling comfort: a cot, a hammock, or perhaps a thick blanket spread over straw. Yet for most soldiers of the ancient and medieval world, the battlefield offered no such luxury. Their beds were improvised from whatever the land and their equipment could provide, and these arrangements reveal much about the ingenuity, adaptability, and hardships of men at war. In truth, the soldier's bed was often nothing more than a compromise between exhaustion and the materials at hand. The most common bed of all was the ground itself. Soldiers, after long marches and the fatigue of carrying heavy gear, often collapsed directly onto earth, stone, or sand, with nothing more than their cloak wrapped around them. In warm climates, this might be tolerable, though insects, dust, and uneven terrain made rest fitful. In colder lands, the ground sucked away warmth, and sleep became a battle against the chill creeping up from beneath. Some armies carried mats of reeds or woven fibers, which could be unrolled to provide a barrier between body and soil. Others scattered straw or hay, if available, to soften the hardness. Yet these were fleeting comforts, quickly worn down by nightly use, and often discarded when forced to march light. The cloak served as both blanket and mattress. A soldier's cloak was one of his most treasured possessions, not only for warmth, but also for its versatility. Draped over the shoulders by day and spread beneath the body by night, it transformed into a shield against both weather and the ground. Roman legionaries, for instance, carried the sagum, a heavy wool cloak that could be wrapped tightly in cold or spread flat to sleep upon. Greek hoplites used the chlamys in much the same way. These garments absorbed the smell of smoke and sweat, grew stiff with dirt and rain, and yet were indispensable for rest. Shields, too, became part of the soldier's bed. Some used them as pillows, the curved surface supporting the head, while others laid them flat to raise their bodies above damp or uneven ground. In some accounts, soldiers even slept with shields covering their bodies, a symbolic reminder that vigilance could not be abandoned even in slumber. For a warrior on campaign, the line between battle gear and bedding blurred, and what had defended him in combat might just as easily cradle his rest. There were, of course, differences in comfort between classes of soldiers. Officers and nobles often carried folding stools, cushions, or even portable bedsteads. These collapsible frames, made of wood or bronze, could be assembled at night and packed away in the morning. They lifted the sleeper above the ground, offering relief from dampness, insects, and cold. Pharaohs, kings, and generals sometimes slept on elaborate camp beds, richly decorated and carried by servants, a striking contrast to the rough arrangements of the common soldier. Yet even in these cases, the presence of war meant that luxury was fragile. The alarm of an enemy raid could strip away all comfort in an instant, forcing even the highest commander to leap from bed into armor. The use of straw and hay was widespread wherever it could be obtained. Soldiers often stuffed sacks with straw to create makeshift mattresses. These sacks were crude, but they provided softness and insulation. The sound of rustling straw became familiar to the ears of men trying to sleep in crowded tents, a reminder of the shared effort to carve comfort from scarcity. When straw grew moldy or infested with pests, it was discarded and replaced, though in long campaigns this was not always possible. Some armies improvised further, using layers of leaves, pine branches, or rushes to cushion their rest. The scent of crushed greenery often lingered in the camp, mingling with smoke and sweat. For steppe warriors and nomads, furs and hides were their beds. A heavy fur spread across the ground, insulated against cold, and provided softness, while smaller hides could be layered or folded for pillows. Horses added to this arrangement. Warriors sometimes leaned against their mounts, tethered close, or even used saddles as support beneath their heads. This blending of human and animal comfort reflected the deep bond between nomadic warriors and their steeds, a partnership that extended even into the vulnerability of sleep. There were also cultural choices about whether to sleep in armor or without it. Some soldiers, fearing surprise attack, rested with armor still strapped to their bodies, their sleep shallow and restless. Others stripped it away, unwilling to bear the weight through the night. In Roman camps, it was common for soldiers to remove armor, but keep it nearby, ready to don at a moment's notice. In less disciplined forces, men sometimes left armor scattered, only to scramble in confusion when alarm sounded. This decision comfort versus readiness was one of the many nightly compromises of the soldier's life. Despite the harshness of these beds, soldiers adapted. The body, pressed night after night against the earth, grew accustomed to the hardness. What might seem unbearable to a civilian became tolerable, even normal, for the man on campaign. Exhaustion played its role as well. After hours of marching, fighting, or laboring, the body demanded rest, no matter how poor the bedding. Men collapsed into slumber, not because the ground was comfortable, but because their strength had reached its end. And yet, there were moments when these improvised beds offered genuine relief. A patch of soft grass, a well-stuffed sack of straw, or a warm fur shared with a comrade could transform the night from torment into peace. In the soldier's memory, such small comforts stood out as blessings, treasured all the more for their rarity. When letters were sent home, men often wrote of missing not food or clothing most, but the simple comfort of a real bed. Picture such a night. A camp settled after a long day, fires burning low. Soldiers lie stretched upon cloaks, shields, and straw, their bodies curled against the chill. The rustle of men shifting on rough bedding mingles with the occasional snore, the cough, or the murmur of dreams. Some rest deeply, their exhaustion pulling them into oblivion, while others stir uneasily, shifting against stones beneath their mats. Around them, the camp is quiet, punctuated only by the steady footsteps of the night watch. These are the beds of the battlefield, improvised, uncomfortable, yet enough to carry men into another day. For the soldier, the bed was never truly separate from the war. It was made of the same tools, the same earth, the same scant resources that defined the rest of his existence. It reflected both his vulnerability and his resilience, the way he endured hardship and still managed to rise at dawn. In every straw-filled sack, every cloak spread on the ground, every shield turned into a pillow, there is the story of a soldier adapting, surviving, and finding rest in the midst of struggle. If there was one opponent every soldier faced, regardless of army, culture, or age, it was the natural world itself. The weather and the elements shaped the nightly rest of ancient soldiers more than almost any other factor. An enemy could be planned for, food could be rationed, and camps could be fortified. But when the sky turned against them, when rains poured, winds howled, or snows fell, soldiers were left at the mercy of nature. Sleep, already fragile on campaign, became even more elusive in the face of storms, heat, and bitter cold. Consider the soldier in a downpour. His cloak and tunic, already worn from weeks of marching, quickly grew soaked, clinging to his body and chilling him to the bone. Tents, if he had them, leaked through seams and seams, dripping steadily onto weary faces. Straw bedding turned to sludge, and mats grew heavy with water. Fires sputtered out in the rain, robbing the camp of its warmth and light. In such conditions, men lay huddled together, their bodies pressed close in an attempt to share what little warmth remained. Sleep, if it came at all, was shallow and restless, broken by shivers and the constant discomfort of wet fabric against the skin. The dawn did not bring relief, but only more exhaustion, as men rose stiff and weary to march on in clothes that refused to dry. In deserts, the challenge was reversed. Heat radiated long after the sun set, the sand beneath a soldier holding the day's fire like an oven. Men tossed and turned, sweat soaking through thin garments, their mouths parched from thirst. The air itself seemed to burn, leaving sleep as elusive as water. When exhaustion finally claimed him, it was in uneasy bursts, broken by thirst or the faint cries of nocturnal animals. Cloaks, so useful in other climates, only added to the suffocating heat, and men often lay uncovered, exposed beneath the vast sky. In such nights, sleep was less a comfort than a collapse, the body giving way despite the oppressive conditions. Cold, however, was the greatest torment of all. Soldiers marching into northern lands, high mountains, or through long winters found nights nearly unbearable. Without modern insulation, they relied on cloaks, furs, and the heat of one another's bodies. Yet the wind cut through every layer, finding seams and gaps, chilling skin, numbing fingers and toes. Snow covered campsites, and men cleared patches only to find the frozen ground beneath still unforgiving. Fires provided relief, but they burned low and could not heat the entire camp. Soldiers who strayed too far from the flames found themselves waking again and again from the sting of frost. Sleep, when it came, was brief, shallow, and filled with dreams of warmth and home. History holds countless accounts of armies crippled not by enemies, but by winter, their nights of broken rest leading to exhaustion, frostbite, and death. Wind was another invisible enemy. On the steppe, it howled endlessly, carrying dust that stung eyes and settled in every fold of clothing. Soldiers tried to shield themselves with cloaks pulled over their heads, but the constant noise and movement of the air robbed them of peace. In forests, wind shook branches, dropping twigs and leaves onto restless sleepers. In mountains, it became a knife, slicing through camps and scattering embers from fires. No matter the location, wind reminded soldiers of their vulnerability, of the thin line between endurance and collapse. Even fair weather posed challenges. The buzzing of insects filled summer nights, gnats and mosquitoes biting at exposed skin, leaving men swatting and scratching instead of resting. In marshy lands, swarms of pests plagued camps, spreading sickness along with irritation. Some armies smoked fires heavily to keep insects away, filling the air with thick haze that made breathing harsh, but kept biting creatures at bay. For men trying to sleep, the smoke itself became another discomfort, making their eyes sting as much as the insects had. The psychological toll of the elements was just as real as the physical one. A soldier lying awake through a storm, hearing thunder roll and rain battering the ground, felt keenly his fragility. The fear of tents collapsing, rivers flooding, or fires dying out weighed on his mind, making true rest impossible. In long campaigns, where nights of poor sleep followed one after another, this mental strain left men irritable, slow to respond, and more prone to mistakes. Commanders understood this, and some adjusted marching schedules to allow for recovery after particularly harsh weather, though often necessity forced them onward regardless. Still, soldiers found ways to cope. They dug trenches to channel rainwater away from sleeping places. They layered pine branches beneath them for insulation against frozen ground. They shared furs and cloaks, pressed side by side in close huddles, trading embarrassment for survival. They even grew accustomed to certain discomforts, their bodies learning to doze, despite rain on their faces or wind in their ears. Adaptation became a soldier's greatest weapon against the elements, for the weather could not be conquered, only endured. Imagine such a night, a camp set along the edge of a forest, rain falling in steady sheets. Fires hiss and smoke as the downpour beats them down. Soldiers huddled beneath cloaks, water dripping from every edge, puddles foaming beneath their bodies. They shift and groan, unable to find dryness. Across the camp, guards pace miserably, their eyes straining through rain and darkness. The hours drag, each minute marked by the sound of drops against leather, until at last the rain lessens, and exhaustion pulls the men into a few final hours of fitful sleep before dawn. Or picture another, an army caught in a mountain pass, snow falling thick through the night. The ground is white, the air sharp with cold. Men cluster tightly, their breaths misting together, their bodies shaking even beneath layers of furs. Fires blaze in the center, but their warmth reaches only those nearest. At the edges of the camp, soldiers lie stiff, waking often, teeth chattering, minds wandering to thoughts of home and hearth. When morning comes, they rise groggy, their limbs heavy, their rest too broken to truly restore them. This was the soldier's nightly companion. Not just the fear of enemies or the hardness of the ground, but the greater and more constant force of the natural world. To march and fight was one trial. To sleep against the elements was another. And yet, through storms, deserts, and winters, soldiers endured, proving again and again that the human spirit could survive even when the very sky seemed set against it. The world of the medieval knight is often imagined in scenes of grandeur gleaming armor, banners fluttering, noble steeds carrying proud warriors into battle. But the nightly life of these men on campaign was far less glamorous. Away from their castles and estates, knights faced the same challenges as ordinary soldiers when it came to rest: the hard ground, the unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of attack. Yet their social rank, resources, and status set them apart, creating a wide gulf between how a knight slept and how the common foot soldier endured the night. For the knight, the tent was the centerpiece of rest. Unlike the leather shelters of Roman legionaries, or the open-air arrangements of Greek hoplites, knights often carried elaborate tents made of heavy canvas or brightly dyed cloth. These tents were large, sometimes circular, and supported by wooden poles, ropes, and stakes. They could be decorated with the knight's heraldry, transforming even a distant campaign field into a space that reminded him of his place in the social order. Within, rugs or straw mats were spread to soften the ground, and wooden chests held clothing, supplies, and personal items. A folding bed or cot, with blankets and furs, lifted the knight above the earth, offering a degree of comfort unthinkable for his men. But luxury was relative. Even in a decorated tent, the knight could not escape the discomforts of campaign life. Canvas leaked in heavy rains, winds rattled the supports, and fires could not be safely lit inside. The sounds of the camp penetrated the thin walls, horses snorting, men muttering, armor clanking, and sentries calling to one another. Despite his rank, the knight lay vulnerable to the same disruptions as the poorest archer, and the anxiety of battle often pressed on his mind just as heavily. The presence of squires and servants made a difference. A knight rarely traveled alone. His squire assisted in setting up the tent, laying out bedding, and preparing clothing and weapons for the next day. Servants might fetch food or maintain fires. These attendants allowed the knight to preserve more energy for battle, sparing him the rougher chores of camp life. While the knight reclined on straw-stuffed mattresses, his squire might lie on the ground nearby, wrapped in a cloak, the difference in their stations marked by the quality of their rest. For common soldiers, the picture was far harsher. Most slept in groups, huddled together in crude shelters of cloth or wood, or more often, simply under the open sky. Their bedding was a cloak or a rough blanket, spread on straw if fortune allowed. Rain and mud soaked through quickly, and fires, while comforting, were limited to what scraps of wood could be gathered. For them, the knight's tent must have seemed a palace, even though by noble standards it was meager. Still, knights faced challenges that were unique to their role. Their armor, heavy and cumbersome, posed knightly decisions. Some knights chose to remove it entirely, trusting their servants to keep it close, while others preferred to sleep partially armored in case of sudden attack. To rest in armor was misery plates dug into flesh, joints stiffened, and breathing felt restricted, but to be caught unarmored in a night raid could mean death. Many knights compromised by sleeping in padded undergarments, leaving the main plates nearby. Even so, sleep was rarely comfortable, haunted by the knowledge that it could be interrupted at any moment. Knights also carried with them the burden of leadership. As nobles, they were often responsible for the men beneath them, and this responsibility intruded into their rest. A knight might lie awake considering tactics, supplies, or the morale of his followers. He might worry over whether his banner would bring glory or disgrace in the coming clash. These concerns, though different from the hunger or cold felt by his soldiers, weighed heavily, turning the hours of night into restless reflections. And yet there were also moments of peace. Inside the tent, a knight might share quiet conversation with his squire, or recite prayers before lying down. In some campaigns, priests accompanied armies, and knights gathered for evening devotions, seeking comfort in faith before surrendering to sleep. Religious rituals lent meaning to the hardships, framing the struggle of campaign life as part of a larger spiritual journey. This sense of divine purpose may have eased the minds of knights more than soft bedding ever could. Imagine a medieval encampment, a wide field dotted with tents, banners fluttering faintly in the night breeze. Fires glow here and there, men clustered around them, eating their last scraps of bread or meat, voices low with fatigue. In the center of the camp, larger tents rise, marked with heraldic symbols. Within one, a knight reclines on his straw mattress, his armor set carefully aside, his sword at arm's reach. His squire lies on a cloak nearby, already drifting to sleep. Outside, the sounds of horses shifting and sentries calling mingle with the crackle of fires. The knight closes his eyes, knowing the ground war awaits at dawn, and though his bed is softer than most, rest still comes uneasily. This contrast between the knight and his men reveals the layered reality of medieval campaign life. Status shaped comfort, but it did not erase hardship. Whether on a straw-filled cot or the bare earth, every soldier on campaign faced the same truth. Rest was fragile, always at the mercy of weather, fear, and the sudden violence of war. For the knight, the tent was a symbol of privilege. But once the canvas walls were breached by cold wind or alarm bells, he was as vulnerable as any man lying beneath the stars. Few experiences tested a soldier's endurance more than the long, grinding ordeal of a siege. Unlike the swift movements of marching armies or the short, furious clashes of open battle, sieges dragged on for weeks, months, and sometimes even years. This slow struggle of attrition wore down body and spirit alike, and nowhere was this more evident than in the way soldiers slept. Rest in a siege camp or within besieged walls was uneasy, shallow, and always vulnerable to sudden disruption. For those who endured, the nightly search for sleep became as much a trial as hunger or battle. For the besieging army, life was a paradox. They lived in the shadow of the enemy. Their camp set just outside the walls of the city or fortress they sought to conquer. Their tents and shelters stood exposed to missiles from above arrows, stones, even flaming projectiles, launched by defenders determined to keep them at bay. Men lying down at night could hear the groan of siege engines and the cries of sentries echoing from the walls. Sleep, if it came, was light, broken often by alarms when defenders launched sudden sorties in the dark. The besiegers built their camps with care, for they knew they might live in them for months. Ditches and palisades ringed the encampments, offering some protection, but these defenses did little to ease the unease in a soldier's mind. They lay down at night with weapons near, knowing the defenders might burst forth at any moment. Guards were doubled or even tripled, the watches strict and unrelenting. This meant that soldiers were awakened often, called to take their turn patrolling in the cold hours of the night. Their bodies, already taxed by laboring at siege works, by day digging trenches, building towers, hauling stones, grew heavy with fatigue, yet rest was never allowed to deepen into true peace. Inside the besieged walls, the struggle was no less harsh. Soldiers defending a fortress or city lived under constant threat of collapse. Walls shook with the impact of rams and catapults, and the cries of the besiegers outside carried through the night. Sleep came in cramped quarters, often crowded with civilians who had sought shelter within the defenses. The air was thick with smoke from torches and the stench of too many bodies pressed together. Bedding was scarce, and many slept on stone floors or hard wooden planks, their cloaks pulled tight against the chill. Hunger, too, made rest difficult, as supplies dwindled and soldiers lay awake with empty stomachs. Fear was a constant companion on both sides. For the besiegers, it was the fear of surprise raids or counterattacks. For the defenders, it was the fear that the walls might fail, that undermining tunnels would suddenly collapse a tower, or that a breach would open while they slept. This fear kept sleep shallow, filled with anxious dreams of collapse and death. Soldiers woke suddenly at noises that might have been only the wind, but could just as easily have been the enemy advancing. Yet, amid these hardships, men still found ways to adapt. Besiegers often built huts of wood, clay, or even turf to shield themselves more effectively than tents, offering better rest during long campaigns. They created routines, dividing labor so that some worked while others slept, ensuring that the strain was shared. Defenders, for their part, learned to doze in short bursts, resting whenever they could between alarms and shifts on the walls. Even the briefest snatches of rest became precious, stolen moments of oblivion in a world that never truly quieted. The sounds of a siege never faded. Night was filled with the groan of wooden engines, the crash of stones striking walls, and the calls of sentries exchanging signals. Fires burned constantly, lighting the camps and the walls, denying the comfort of true darkness. A soldier lying on his cloak could not escape these reminders of war, his dreams colored by the very noises that surrounded him. Imagine such a night, an army camped before a walled city, the glow of hundreds of campfires spreading across the fields. In the distance, the silhouette of towers looms, torches flickering along the walls. Soldiers huddle in their tents, lying on straw or cloaks, their bodies weary from hauling siege equipment all day. The night air is restless with sound, the creak of wood, the clang of tools, the murmur of sentries calling out their posts. A sudden cry pierces the darkness, and the camp stirs, men grasping weapons, hearts pounding, only to discover it was a false alarm. They settle again, but sleep, once broken, is slow to return. Or within the walls, soldiers and townsfolk packed together in narrow chambers, the air stifling and thick. Men lie shoulder to shoulder, children crying softly in the corner, elders muttering prayers. The floor is hard, the hunger sharp, and every rumble of stone makes hearts leap. Some drift into uneasy sleep, dreaming of home or freedom, while others lie awake, eyes open, staring into the shadows until exhaustion finally closes them. Siege warfare made sleep another battlefield. The constant noise, the interruptions of guard duty, the hunger and fear, these turned the night into a trial as harsh as the day. And yet soldiers endured, because they had no choice. They rose each morning, bleary-eyed and weary, to continue the struggle, sustained not by deep rest, but by fragments of sleep stolen amid the chaos. Their resilience is a reminder that, even in the harshest of human struggles, the body and spirit can cling to survival, carrying men through when comfort is nowhere to be found. Life at sea brought with it challenges unlike any faced on land, and among the most relentless of these was the nightly struggle to sleep. For the sailor or naval soldier, rest was not taken beneath the stars or inside a tent, but on the decks or within the cramped, swaying hull of a ship. The ocean was never still, and its constant movement meant that even in moments of calm, sleep was fragile. Add to this the closeness of dozens or even hundreds of men packed into tight quarters, the creaking of wood, the lapping of waves, and the ever-present danger of storms or enemy attacks, and it becomes clear why the sailor's bed was one of the hardest places in all of history to truly find rest. On ancient galleys, such as those rowed by Greek or Roman crews, soldiers and sailors alike often slept where they worked. Rowers, chained or bound to benches in the most brutal examples, rested slumped over their oars during brief pauses. When ships anchored or pulled to shore for the night, men might lie upon the decks, their cloaks wrapped tightly against the sea air. The wood beneath them was hard, damp with spray, and often crawling with vermin. Yet after the exhausting labor of rowing or the tension of awaiting battle, even such conditions were enough to drag them into a few hours of sleep. Naval soldiers, those stationed aboard to fight in sea battles or to guard against boarding, faced similar discomforts. Their weapons were stacked close at hand, their armor sometimes doubling as pillows or as burdens they dared not set too far away. They slept lightly, for at any moment a lookout's cry might announce the approach of another vessel. The sea did not respect the rhythms of day and night. An attack could come in the darkness as easily as at dawn, and men learned to wake swiftly at the sound of alarm. As naval technology advanced, hammocks became a common solution. By the time of later medieval and early modern navies, sailors slung hammocks from beams, allowing them to sway with the ship's movement. These offered some comfort compared to sleeping on the deck, as the hammock cradled the body and kept it off the damp boards below. Yet even hammocks were crowded close together, so that men slept shoulder to shoulder, their breaths mingling, the air heavy with the smell of salt, sweat, and tar. Privacy did not exist, and rest was often shallow in such close company. The elements, too, were merciless. In storms, when waves crashed and ships pitched violently, sleep became impossible. Men clung to ropes or braced themselves in hammocks, their stomachs turning with nausea, their minds too alert with fear of capsizing to allow any real rest. In calmer weather, the sea's gentle rocking could lull some into slumber, though just as often the creak of wood or the drip of water kept them uneasy. The air below decks grew hot and stifling in warm climates, filled with smoke from lamps and the stench of bodies pressed together. In cold seas, the damp chill gnawed at bones, leaving men shivering even beneath blankets. Food and drink played their role in rest aboard ship. Sailors ate salted meat, hard biscuits, and dried peas, washed down with beer, watered wine, or, in later navies, grog. These rations were heavy and sometimes spoiled, but the fullness of a meal could ease the body into a reluctant sleep. Alcohol, in particular, dulled senses and allowed men to rest despite the noise and closeness of their quarters. Yet drunkenness carried its own dangers, dulling the response to alarms or leaving men vulnerable in moments when swift action was needed. Night watches were even stricter at sea than on land. Crews divided the dark hours into shifts, with some men posted on deck to keep lookout while others tried to rest. Bells or drums marked the changing of these watches, their sounds cutting through the night and waking even those not on duty. A sailor might lie down, only to drift into light sleep before being summoned to stand his turn in the cold spray. He returned hours later, weary, and tried again to find rest amid the noise and bustle of others rising for their own shifts. The cycle left men in a state of perpetual tiredness, their strength sapped by the sea's unrelenting demands. Despite these hardships, sailors adapted, just as soldiers on land did. They learned to sleep in snatches, to doze lightly through noise, to cradle their bodies against movement. They found comfort in routine, the same watch hours, the same meals, the same companions nearby. They took solace in conversation, in shared songs before settling down, in the knowledge that everyone endured the same trials. Sleep was not abundant, but it was shared, and this sense of community helped men bear it. Picture such a night aboard a war galley, the ship moored near shore, the moonlight reflecting on rippling waves. On deck, a few men pace, eyes scanning the horizon, spears or bows in hand. Below, soldiers and sailors lie in cramped rows, cloaks pulled close, their breaths mingling in the stale air. The wood creaks with every swell, and water drips steadily from seams. Some sleep soundly, exhaustion overpowering discomfort. Others lie awake, staring into the shadows, listening to the endless rhythm of the sea. In the distance, gulls cry, and the faint splash of fish breaks the silence. Slowly, the ship settles into the restless slumber of its crew, a floating camp at the mercy of wind and tide. For naval soldiers and sailors, sleep was never secure, never abundant, never truly restful. It was another battle, fought daily against the ocean's whims and the demands of watch and duty. Yet they endured, as all soldiers did, finding enough rest to rise with the dawn and take their places once more in the ceaseless struggle of war at sea. For the ancient soldier, sleep was never just a physical act. It was also a moment steeped in ritual, belief, and superstition. When men lay down after a day of marching or fighting, they were not only surrendering their bodies to exhaustion, but also placing their spirits into a vulnerable state. Across cultures and centuries, soldiers surrounded their nightly rest with prayers, charms and customs meant to protect them from dangers, both real and unseen. These rituals reveal how deeply entwined sleep was with the spiritual life of the soldier, and how belief helped them endure the uncertainties of war. In many armies, prayers were the first step before sleep. Roman legionaries often invoked household gods, even on campaign, carrying small figurines or amulets of deities such as Jupiter, Mars, or Fortuna. They might whisper short invocations, asking for protection through the night and strength for the coming day. Greek hoplites, influenced by their strong connection to omens and prophecy, prayed to Zeus or Athena before lying down, trusting in divine guardianship. In Egypt, soldiers called upon Re to watch over them as the sun disappeared, or upon Osiris for safe passage through the symbolic night that mirrored death itself. These prayers provided reassurance that even as their eyes closed, a higher power stood watch in their stead. Amulets and charms played a central role in these nightly rituals. Soldiers across cultures carried objects meant to ward off misfortune during sleep. An Egyptian might place a scarab amulet near his body, believing it offered renewal and protection. Mesopotamian soldiers often carried carved stones inscribed with protective spells, which they placed beneath pillows or cloaks. Roman soldiers wore small pendants, sometimes inscribed with words meant to deflect evil spirits. These objects, though small, carried immense psychological weight, offering a sense of control over the vulnerability of sleep. Dreams themselves were seen as gateways to the divine. Soldiers often regarded their dreams as messages from gods or ancestors, and so rituals were performed to invite favorable visions. Greek and Roman armies consulted dream interpreters, men skilled in reading omens, who could advise whether a dream foretold victory or defeat. A soldier who dreamed of triumph might awaken heartened, while one who dreamed of loss might find himself gripped with dread. In some cases, commanders used these interpretations to shape morale, spreading word of favorable dreams to lift the spirits of their men. Rituals also extended to the structure of the camp itself. In Roman armies, the building of a camp was not only a practical matter, but also a spiritual one. The act of marking boundaries and placing altars reinforced the idea that the camp was protected space, sanctified for rest. Sacrifices might be offered before nightfall, and incense burned to ward off malevolent forces. Among nomadic warriors of the steppe, shamans sometimes performed rituals before sleep, beating drums, chanting, or burning herbs to drive away spirits that might disturb rest. These ceremonies bound the community together, offering not only protection, but also unity in the face of uncertainty. For medieval soldiers, Christian prayer shaped the nightly routine. Knights often knelt before simple crosses or icons before retiring, asking God or saints for protection. Psalms and blessings were recited to guard against the dangers of both battle and the unseen forces believed to haunt the night. Soldiers carried rosaries or relics, kissed before lying down, their faith providing strength in moments when fear threatened to overwhelm them. In Islamic armies, soldiers prayed their evening prayers, trusting in Allah's mercy as they prepared to close their eyes. The act of prayer before rest became a way to hand one's fears to the divine, to find peace in a world filled with danger. Superstition often filled the gaps where ritual did not suffice. Some soldiers refused to sleep with their heads pointing west, believing it invited death, while others carried herbs such as lavender or garlic as warding agents. Among the Celts, charms of iron were believed to repel malevolent forces during the night. In Asia, soldiers sometimes burned incense or hung protective symbols above their sleeping places. These small gestures offered reassurance, creating a fragile shield against the unknown. Even the simple act of lying down was often guided by ritual. Some cultures preferred to sleep in a certain orientation, facing east toward the rising sun, symbolizing renewal and the promise of dawn. Others avoided sleeping directly on their backs, believing it left them open to spirits or bad dreams. Soldiers accustomed themselves to these habits, their nightly rest shaped by invisible rules passed down through generations. Yet belief was not only about protection. It was also about comfort. Rituals calmed the mind, easing soldiers into sleep despite the noise, the cold, or the fear. A whispered prayer, a charm touched to the lips, a gesture repeated night after night, these created a rhythm, a sense of familiarity in unfamiliar lands. Even when far from home, soldiers could carry a piece of their traditions with them into the darkness, and this gave them the strength to endure. Imagine such a scene, a Roman camp at twilight, the fires glowing across orderly rows of tents. Soldiers eat their rations, speak quietly, and then, before lying down, murmur prayers to their gods. Some touch amulets hanging from cords around their necks, others lay small tokens beneath their cloaks. Across the camp, Greek soldiers whisper to one another of dreams, debating their meanings. In another corner of the world, an Egyptian soldier rolls out his reed mat, pressing a scarab close to his chest before closing his eyes. Centuries later, a medieval knight kneels on straw, murmuring Latin prayers by the light of a candle before laying down in his tent. In all these places, the rituals echo one another, separated by culture, yet united by purpose, to find safety in the most vulnerable of human acts. Through these customs, soldiers found a way to surrender to sleep, to trust that something greater than themselves would guard the night. And in this trust, fragile but powerful, they discovered a measure of peace that no weapon, wall, or watch could provide. Though war was often a lonely burden for the soul, soldiers rarely faced their nights entirely alone. Across history, what gave rest its greatest measure of comfort was not the cloak, the fire, or even the safety of a fortified camp, but the presence of comrades nearby. Companionship was both a necessity and a balm, and it shaped the nightly life of armies as surely as armor or weapons did. When exhaustion pressed down on weary men, the closeness of their fellows offered reassurance, and in this shared vulnerability, brotherhood was forged. On campaign, soldiers slept in groups out of both necessity and habit. Roman legionaries shared tents with their contubernium. 8 men who became almost like family. They marched together, ate together, built camps together, and when night came, they lay side by side on the same straw, their breaths mingling in the enclosed space. These men came to know one another's quirks and weaknesses, the sound of each snore, the words muttered in sleep. Bonds that were forged in the daylight of training and battle deepened in the darkness, when each man's safety depended on the other's vigilance. Greek and Macedonian soldiers shared similar closeness. Cloaks were wrapped around 2 or more men at once, their warmth doubled by the body heat of companions. Songs and stories passed between them as the fires burned low, easing fears and strengthening the sense of unity. When Alexander's army marched deep into foreign lands, what sustained many was not only the promise of glory, but also the companionship of those who lay down beside them each night. The laughter before sleep, the whispered encouragement, the comfort of hearing another's steady breathing. These were small things, but they gave courage in the face of exhaustion and danger. Among steppe warriors, brotherhood was marked by even more physical closeness. In the bitter cold of the plains, men huddled tightly together beneath firs, their bodies pressed for warmth. To sleep apart was to risk freezing, and so bonds were sealed not only in battle, but also in the nightly sharing of heat. Horses, too, became part of this companionship, tethered close to their masters, their warm breath and steady presence reminding men that they were never truly alone. In medieval armies, the closeness of camp life blurred the lines between noble and common soldiers. While knights might sleep in tents with squires, they still depended on the mass of soldiers camped around them. Fires became gathering places where men shared bread, meat, or wine, their laughter rising into the night. Tales of home, of loves left behind, or of past battles filled the hours before slumber. Even in armies drawn from different regions or languages, the common hardships of campaign life bred camaraderie. When men slept shoulder to shoulder beneath thin blankets, divisions of status faded, if only for a few hours. The act of telling stories before bed was nearly universal. Soldiers recounted legends, boasted of past feats, or joked to lighten spirits. In Rome, tales of old battles were passed down, binding the present generation of soldiers to those who came before. In Greece, songs honored heroes, their melodies softening the harshness of the night. Steppe warriors recited epics, their voices carrying across the grasslands as comrades drifted into dreams. These stories, half entertainment and half ritual, eased the transition from wakefulness to rest, giving shape to the soldier's night. Brotherhood also meant sharing burdens. When one soldier lacked a cloak, another might spread his wide enough for 2. When one was injured, companions propped him up, ensuring he could rest with some measure of comfort. Food, bedding, and even dreams were shared, creating a sense of mutual reliance. This companionship was not only kindness, but also survival, for no man could endure campaign life entirely on his own. To sleep with others was to feel the reassurance that someone would notice if danger approached, that someone's hand would shake you awake if fire or sword threatened in the dark. The closeness of comradeship also helped ease the loneliness of war. Soldiers often spoke of missing their families, their wives, their children. But in the absence of home, their fellow soldiers became brothers, filling the void with companionship. The bonds created through shared nights on campaign often outlasted the wars themselves. Veterans, when recalling their service, frequently remembered not just the battles, but the friendships formed around campfires, the comfort of a comrade's presence in the stillness of night. Imagine such a scene. A group of soldiers sprawled around a dying fire, their cloaks pulled close. One strums a simple tune, another tells a story that drifts into laughter. The night deepens, voices fade, and one by one, they recline on straw and cloaks, their heads resting near one another. The warmth of bodies, the comfort of familiar voices, and the soft murmur of shared breathing fill the space. Fear is present, but it is held at bay by the knowledge that none sleep alone. This companionship transformed the act of sleeping into something greater than mere rest. It was a nightly reminder that no man carried the burden of war entirely on his own. In the silence of the camp, in the fragile hours before dawn, soldiers found not only sleep, but also the reassurance of brotherhood, a bond as essential as food or fire, and perhaps the truest comfort of all. For as long as there have been soldiers, there has been the search for ways to quiet the mind and ease the body into rest. War brought with it exhaustion, but also noise, fear, hunger, and pain forces that did not always let a man drift into sleep easily. In the absence of true comfort, many armies turned to substances that dulled the edge of hardship. Alcohol and herbal sedatives became nightly companions for countless soldiers across the ancient and medieval world, tools to soothe nerves, ease wounds, and carry weary men into slumber, even when their surroundings offered little peace. Alcohol was the most universal of these aids. In Egypt, soldiers drank beer made from barley, a thick and filling brew that was as much food as drink. The Assyrians and Babylonians drank wine and stronger fermented beverages, often diluted with water to stretch rations, but still enough to relax the body. Roman soldiers received rations of wine, a daily allowance that became part of their pay and identity. This wine was rarely refined. It was often sour or mixed with herbs, honey, or even seawater, but it was a comfort. A cup of wine at day's end warmed the blood, dulled aches, and made the hard ground seem less unyielding. For Greek soldiers, wine was central not only to their meals, but also to their culture. Shared from a common crater or jug, it was diluted with water and passed between comrades. The ritual of drinking together, accompanied by song or conversation, brought a sense of familiarity even in the strangeness of campaign life. For hoplites and Macedonian soldiers, this nightly ritual reinforced camaraderie while also loosening the grip of fear before sleep. In the cold lands of the north, beer and mead became the soldiers' rest-inducing companions. Germanic tribes and later medieval soldiers drank these in abundance when available, their sweet heaviness bringing warmth to the body. Mead, made from honey, was considered almost divine in some cultures, and its intoxicating effects were both celebrated and relied upon. To lie down after a night of drinking mead was to fall not into gentle slumber, but into a heavy, dream-filled rest that often ignored the discomfort of earth or stone beneath. Steppe warriors, too, had their own drink fermented maize milk. Its mildly alcoholic content offered warmth and calm at the end of long days of riding. Warriors drank deeply before lying down on the cold ground, the drink easing the transition into uneasy rest. For nomads who endured bitter winters and endless campaigns, this nightly ritual was as important as fire or food. But alcohol was not the only aid. Herbal sedatives, though less widespread, played a role across many cultures. Poppies, cultivated in Mesopotamia and later across the Mediterranean, offered extracts that could dull pain and induce drowsiness. Soldiers wounded in battle might be given mixtures derived from poppy seeds or sap, their pain dulled enough to allow for rest. In Greece, physicians mixed herbs like mandrake or henbane into concoctions for soldiers, not only to treat wounds, but also to calm restless minds. These were crude medicines, often imprecise in dosage, but they reflected humanity's constant attempt to bring peace to the body in times of turmoil. In medieval Europe, soldiers sometimes carried pouches of herbs thought to encourage sleep. Lavender, valerian, and chamomile were used by healers, brewed into teas or burned as incense. Monastic orders that marched with armies occasionally offered such remedies, blending spiritual comfort with herbal care. Though not as immediate as alcohol, these herbs soothed the restless, gave relief to the wounded, and allowed for deeper slumber in the midst of chaos. There was, of course, a danger in relying too heavily on drink or drugs. Alcohol dulled reflexes, slowed reactions, and left men vulnerable if alarms sounded. A soldier too deeply asleep might not wake in time to take up arms, and drunkenness in the ranks could lead to disorder or disaster. Commanders were often torn between allowing their men the relief of alcohol and preventing the risks it carried. Some armies issued controlled rations, while others turned a blind eye to excess, understanding that morale often depended on the nightly cup. Yet despite these risks, the nightly ritual of drink or herb became ingrained in military life. It was not merely about intoxication, but about creating a sense of normalcy, a rhythm to the day's end. To gather around the fire, pass a jug, sing softly, and then settle down in the haze of alcohol was a pattern repeated across centuries. It reminded soldiers that they were not only warriors, but also men, seeking the same small comforts as their ancestors and descendants. Picture such a night. A Roman camp glowing with small fires, men gathered in clusters, cups of sour wine in hand. Laughter drifts through the night, voices softening as the drink takes hold. Some sing low songs, others speak of home, and soon, one by one, they recline on cloaks, their bodies warmed, their minds loosened. In another land, steppe warriors drink kumi, the taste sharp and sour on their tongues, before lying beneath firs with their horses tethered nearby. In medieval Europe, soldiers sip mead, the sweetness clinging to their lips as they murmur prayers before settling into straw. The drinks differ, but the purpose is the same: to ease the soldier into the fragile peace of sleep. Through alcohol and sedatives, ancient and medieval soldiers found a way to soften the harshness of campaign life. These substances dulled pain, lifted spirits, and allowed for rest when fear and hardship might otherwise have kept eyes open through the night. Though never without risk, they were part of the nightly ritual of war, reminders that even in battle, men sought comfort in the oldest ways known to humanity: food, fire, fellowship, and the gentle hand of sleep. While ordinary soldiers endured the earth as their bed, cloaks as their blankets, and the restless noise of comrades beside them, commanders often lived a very different nightly reality. Generals, kings, and nobles on campaign had the power and resources to shape their quarters into spaces of relative comfort. Yet even for the highest leaders, rest was not free of hardship. Their sleeping arrangements revealed both their elevated status and the unique burdens of leadership, as the weight of responsibility often pressed just as heavily on their minds as the cold ground did on their men. In the Roman army, a general such as Julius Caesar or Scipio Africanus slept in a tent set apart from the mass of legionaries. This tent, larger and more elaborate than the leather shelters of common soldiers, might contain folding furniture, rugs, and a raised bed. Servants and aides ensured that the general's quarters were dry, orderly, and supplied with food and drink. Yet Roman commanders were careful to balance comfort with discipline. Caesar was known for his ability to endure hardship alongside his soldiers, sometimes sleeping directly on the ground with only a cloak. This practice built loyalty, showing his men that he shared their struggles. Other commanders preferred luxury, and their tents became symbols of status lavish enough to impress allies, but also tempting targets for enemies during raids. In Greek and Macedonian armies, leaders such as Alexander the Great often set the tone by the way they rested. Alexander was famous for his modesty in sleep. He carried little more than a simple bedroll and was said to endure the same rough conditions as his men when necessary. This not only demonstrated his endurance, but also reinforced his image as a warrior king, bound to his army by shared hardship. His closest companions, however, often had more elaborate quarters, with tents furnished for comfort and guarded by attendants. Even so, the Greek tradition valued simplicity, and excessive luxury was sometimes seen as weakness or effeminacy. In contrast, Persian kings and their generals brought with them opulence, even on campaign. Their tents were enormous, sometimes described as mobile palaces with decorated carpets, cushions, and intricate furnishings. Servants attended to every detail, and guards surrounded the quarters to ensure safety. While such arrangements ensured greater comfort, they also created distance between leader and soldier, a separation that sometimes weakened bonds of trust. Medieval Europe brought a wide spectrum of experiences. Kings and great lords marched with entire retinues, their tents vast and colorful, adorned with heraldic symbols. Inside, they enjoyed beds with thick mattresses, chests filled with clothing, and furs piled high for warmth. Servants, squires, and even cooks traveled with them, ensuring that their meals and rest were as close to home as possible. Yet not all commanders indulged in luxury. Some knights and noble leaders made a show of sharing in the hardships of their men, sleeping on straw-stuffed sacks or simple cots, their tents modest compared to their wealth. Such gestures of humility reinforced loyalty, reminding soldiers that their leaders were not insulated from the same cold, fear, and weariness. Leadership, however, carried burdens that even the finest bed could not ease. A commander's mind was rarely still at night. He lay awake considering the placement of troops, the supplies dwindling in wagons, or the reports of scouts. He worried over alliances, betrayals, and the morale of his men. In times of siege or pursuit, he might rise in the middle of the night to confer with aides or to check on sentries. Rest was broken not by discomfort, but by the endless weight of responsibility. Many great leaders were known for their ability to sleep little, waking early and working long into the night, their stamina as much a weapon as their strategies. The quarters of commanders also played symbolic roles. A general's tent was a place where soldiers came to deliver reports, receive orders, or seek judgment. At night, the flickering torchlight within cast long shadows, creating an aura of authority. To soldiers passing by, the large tent set apart in the camp was both a reminder of hierarchy and a reassurance that leadership was present. In times of hardship, the sight of the commander's banner above his quarters gave hope that order still held. Imagine a medieval encampment spread across a field, hundreds of small tents scattered in uneven rows. In the center stands a vast pavilion, brightly dyed, its banners visible even in moonlight. Inside, a lord reclines on a cushioned bed, his sword resting nearby, while scribes record orders by lamplight. Outside, squires and guards maintain the perimeter, their eyes scanning the dark. Meanwhile, only a short distance away, common soldiers huddle beneath thin cloaks, their rest fragile. The gulf between their beds and his is wide, yet the outcome of the campaign binds them all together. Or think of a Roman camp, orderly and fortified, with one tent slightly larger than the rest. Within, a general studies maps spread across a table, his aides murmuring reports. At last, when his eyes grow heavy, he lies down on a folding bed, his mind still racing with thoughts of the next day's march. His soldiers, only a few dozen steps away, already sleep on the ground, their trust placed in him to guide them through tomorrow's dangers. In every age, the contrast between the quarters of commanders and those of ordinary soldiers highlights the inequality of war. Comfort was afforded to the few, hardship borne by the many. Yet comfort did not guarantee rest, for the sleeplessness of responsibility weighed just as heavily as the cold ground. In this way, commanders shared in the universal struggle of soldiers, to find peace in the midst of war, even when the body lay still, but the mind refused to quiet. Sleep was more than a comfort for the soldier. It was a necessity as vital as food or water. When deprived of it, the body faltered, the mind grew clouded, and mistakes multiplied. Armies could withstand hunger for days, march for miles, and endure wounds with stoic grit, but lack of rest slowly eroded their strength in ways that were both invisible and devastating. Throughout history, the cost of sleep deprivation on campaign was measured not only in weary steps and clouded eyes, but in battles lost, strategies ruined, and lives cut short. The human body has limits, and ancient soldiers pressed against them constantly. A single night of poor rest left men sluggish, their movements slower, their tempers short. Days without true sleep pushed them into a haze of exhaustion, where the simplest commands felt heavy and confusion set in. For a soldier asked to march in formation, to carry heavy arms, or to respond instantly to orders, this mental fog could prove disastrous. Entire phalanxes or legions depended on precise movements, and when fatigue dulled reaction time, the carefully built machinery of war faltered. Commanders were well aware of this danger. Roman generals scheduled watches to balance vigilance with rest, knowing that exhausted soldiers were vulnerable soldiers. Greek leaders insisted on pauses during long marches to prevent collapse. Steppe warriors, who lived by constant movement, adapted by sleeping in short bursts whenever possible. Yet no matter the precautions, the rigors of campaign life often robbed men of the sleep they desperately needed. Forced marches, surprise raids, and long sieges kept armies awake for days, leaving them hollow-eyed and staggering. The psychological cost was just as great. Exhaustion gnawed at the mind, eroding discipline. Soldiers deprived of rest became irritable, quick to quarrel, and less obedient to orders. Morale weakened when nights brought no relief, and hope faded more quickly when men were too weary to think clearly. Dreams, once a source of meaning or comfort, turned into hallucinations. Men heard voices in the wind, saw shapes in the dark, and mistook shadows for enemies. These illusions could spark panic, leading to false alarms that rippled through the camp and drained what little energy remained. History holds countless examples of armies undone by lack of sleep. When soldiers marched all night to launch surprise attacks, their strength often failed them by morning. Victories won in early clashes turned into defeats as exhaustion overcame their ability to fight on. During sieges, both defenders and attackers endured long nights of watchfulness, their eyes heavy, their minds dulled, and their bodies weakened. In such conditions, mistakes multiplied, gates left unguarded, signals missed, and weapons fumbled at the crucial moment. Many a fortress fell not to superior arms, but to the sheer inability of weary men to remain alert. Sleep deprivation also took a deadly toll in battle. Soldiers fought less effectively, their strikes poorly aimed, their shields raised too slowly. Cavalrymen nodded in the saddle, risking collapse or fatal falls. Archers loosed arrows without precision, their aim swayed by trembling hands. The body's strength waned, muscles refusing to respond with the same sharpness as when well rested. Against fresh enemies, exhausted armies stood little chance, no matter their numbers or equipment. The effects extended beyond the battlefield. Marshes stretched longer when men stumbled from fatigue, wagons lagged, and supplies dwindled as progress slowed. Camp chores were neglected, fires left unattended, trenches dug poorly. Disease spread more easily through exhausted bodies, whose immune defenses weakened without proper rest. A tired army was not only less effective in combat, but also more vulnerable to sickness, hunger, and despair. Commanders themselves were not immune. The burden of leadership often kept generals awake, planning through the night or pacing in worry. Some, like Alexander or Caesar, could endure long stretches with little sleep, but even they risked lapses of judgment. A single poor decision, born of exhaustion, could unravel months of planning. Armies depended on sharp minds as much as strong bodies, and when sleep deprivation clouded both, disaster loomed. Imagine such a night, an army on forced march, trudging through darkness toward an enemy camp. The men stumble, their legs heavy, their heads nodding even as they walk. The clatter of gear grows louder as discipline falters, and whispers spread through the ranks. By dawn, they collapse into position, too weary to fight with strength. The enemy, better rested, strikes swiftly, and the weary soldiers find their shields slipping, their lines breaking. Exhaustion, more than sword or spear, decides the outcome. Or picture a besieged city. Night after night, the defenders stand on the walls, eyes straining into the darkness for signs of attack. They lean on spears, heads drooping, jolting awake at the smallest sound. After weeks of this, their vigilance weakens. One night, a gate is left less guarded, or a wall is manned by soldiers too drowsy to notice ladders in the dark. By dawn, the city has fallen, its defenders betrayed not by cowardice, but by weariness. The cost of sleep deprivation was not always immediate, but it was always accumulating. Each night without rest took something from the soldier: a fragment of strength, a shred of focus, a piece of spirit. Over time, these fragments added up until entire armies stood hollowed, fighting less against the enemy and more against their own exhaustion. It is a reminder that even the greatest armies in history, with all their discipline, courage, and weapons, were bound by the same human need, the simple act of sleep. And so, in every campaign, rest was as strategic as any maneuver. Commanders who found ways to grant their men true sleep preserved their strength. Those who drove them past endurance risked losing not only battles, but entire wars. In the end, sleep deprivation was a silent enemy, one that could topple empires as surely as any blade. Though history often remembers battles in terms of numbers, weapons, and strategies, the hidden factor of sleep or the lack of it shaped outcomes in ways seldom acknowledged. Armies were made of flesh and blood, and fatigue could turn even the most disciplined troops into stumbling, sluggish shadows of themselves. Victories were sometimes snatched because one side had slept while the other had marched through the night. Defeats, too, were sealed not by inferior courage, but by the fog of exhaustion. In many ways, the history of warfare is also a history of sleep. Who had it, who lost it, and how its absence tipped the balance of fate. One of the most striking truths is that surprise often depended on sleeplessness. Commanders who drove their armies through the night to launch dawn attacks gambled on the exhaustion of their men against the vulnerability of their enemies. When successful, the results were devastating. An army awakened in confusion, scrambling to put on armor and form ranks, could be routed by a smaller but better rested force. Yet when the gamble failed, when exhausted troops faltered at the moment of attack, the results were just as disastrous, leaving men too tired to fight effectively against an enemy ready and waiting. Consider Alexander the Great, whose lightning-fast campaigns often relied on forced marches that left his men weary but positioned for decisive strikes. His troops sometimes marched through the night to surprise foes at dawn, their discipline allowing them to endure exhaustion long enough to secure victory. The success of such maneuvers lay not only in strategy, but in the soldiers' capacity to fight despite sleeplessness, a testament to their training and resilience. Yet had their discipline faltered, the same tactics could have led to ruin. The Romans, masters of discipline and organization, also understood the role of sleep in battle. Their carefully structured camps and rotating watches ensured that their soldiers were less likely to be caught off guard by surprise attacks at night. Accounts from campaigns in Gaul and Germania describe how Roman forces withstood night raids because sentries were alert and soldiers rested in readiness. By contrast, opponents who neglected proper watches often found their camps overrun while men slept too deeply to resist. In this way, the Roman emphasis on order preserved strength where other armies crumbled. Siege warfare offered countless examples of sleep shaping victory and defeat. Defenders deprived of rest by relentless bombardment grew weaker each day, their vigilance failing after weeks of interrupted nights. Attackers, meanwhile, sometimes used sleep as a weapon, keeping defenders awake with noise, feigned assaults, and constant harassment until exhaustion did their work for them. A wall might hold against rams and stones, but no wall could shield the mind from fatigue. Cities fell not only because gates were breached, but because weary defenders could no longer keep watch. Medieval battles, too, were shaped by sleep. Knights who spent the night in revelry before battle sometimes faced the field heavy with drink and drowsiness, their energy dulled at the very moment it was needed most. Chroniclers tell of campaigns where poor rest the night before left armies sluggish, their charges faltering, their formations collapsing. Conversely, leaders who ensured their men ate, prayed, and slept before battle often found their troops sharper, more disciplined, and better able to endure the clash of steel at dawn. The cost of sleeplessness also appeared in long pursuits. Armies on the run, driven day and night without pause, often collapsed not from battle but from exhaustion. Pursuers who allowed themselves even a few hours of proper rest could overtake enemies staggering with fatigue. Many a retreat turned into a rout simply because fleeing soldiers could no longer put one foot in front of the other without stumbling. On sea as well, sleep dictated outcomes. Crews who rowed or manned sails through the night were often too spent to fight effectively the next day. Naval commanders who allowed shifts of true rest preserved their strength, while those who demanded endless labor often found their men unable to respond when the enemy appeared. The sea, unyielding and unpredictable, punished exhaustion swiftly, capsizing ships whose crews could no longer muster the alertness to manage them. Even leaders themselves were vulnerable to the power of sleep. A general deprived of rest might misjudge enemy movements, fail to hear a report, or give orders clouded by fatigue. History is dotted with commanders whose brilliance faltered when sleeplessness dulled their minds. Conversely, a leader who took time to rest even briefly could make decisions with clarity that shifted the course of battle. The difference between triumph and disaster was sometimes no more than the clarity of a well-rested mind. Imagine two armies facing one another at dawn. One has marched all night, its soldiers stumbling into position, their eyes heavy, their bodies sluggish. The other has slept, its soldiers rising with clearer minds, their strength replenished by hours of rest. As the sun rises, the rested army advances with steady steps, while the weary one falters. In that moment, the outcome is not decided by weapons or numbers, but by the simple fact of sleep. Or picture a besieged city, its defenders kept awake night after night by constant bombardment. They stumble along the walls, eyes half shut, their arrows loosed without aim. When at last the enemy launches a real assault, the exhausted defenders cannot resist. The walls fall not because the stones are weak, but because the men are. Throughout history, battles were shaped as much by sleep as by steel. Though chroniclers praised courage and strategy, beneath their tales lay the unspoken truth. Men who slept could fight, and men who did not often fell. In the great ledger of war, victories and defeats were sometimes written not in blood alone, but in the quiet hours of the night, when armies closed their eyes or failed to. Every campaign, no matter the age or the culture, carried with it long nights that seemed to stretch endlessly. For the soldier, these nights were not only times of attempted rest, but also moments of reflection, of longing, and of quiet endurance. Beneath the stars, with fires burning low and comrades breathing heavily nearby, a soldier often found himself alone with his thoughts, even in the crowded company of a camp. The long night was a universal experience, the soldier's most vulnerable and most human moment. Darkness was both friend and enemy. It concealed the soldier from watchful foes, wrapping the camp in a cloak of obscurity. But it also concealed dangers, leaving the imagination to wander. Every rustle of wind could become an enemy scout, every distant cry a signal of attack. Men lying down with weapons close by stared into the blackness, straining their ears, waiting for a sound that might never come. Sleep came haltingly, interrupted by jolts of fear, and the night became a battlefield of the mind. The soldier's long night was filled with memories of home. Away from families and familiar comforts, the hours stretched with loneliness. Many thought of loved ones, picturing wives, children, or parents sitting beneath the same stars far away. Others remembered fields, villages, or hearths abandoned for the march of war. These thoughts brought both comfort and pain comfort in imagining what was waiting for them, pain in the uncertainty of whether they would ever see it again. Soldiers who spoke of home before lying down often did so softly, as if afraid to break the fragile hope these images carried. In some cases, the long night became a time for prayer. Roman soldiers whispered invocations to Mars or Fortuna. Medieval knights recited psalms or sought the intercession of saints. Steppe warriors entrusted their spirits to the winds and skies, believing that the world itself watched over them. For many, this ritual helped ease them into slumber, a way of giving their fears to the divine and trusting that dawn would bring safety. The silence of night also revealed the small, ordinary sounds of the camp, the crackle of fading fires, the shifting of horses, the soft murmur of comrades' dreams. For the weary, these sounds became a lullaby of sorts, steady rhythms that reminded them they were not alone. Even in fear, the presence of others gave reassurance. A soldier who could not sleep might sit up, watching the stars, while nearby a comrade's snores filled the darkness. In that companionship, even sleepless hours felt more bearable. Yet the long night was not always still. Alarms often shattered its fragile calm. A sentry's cry could send men scrambling from slumber, reaching for weapons, hearts pounding. Sometimes the alarm proved false deer, startled at the camp's edge, or shadows mistaken for enemies, but once broken, sleep was slow to return. The body lay restless, the mind racing with thoughts of what might have been. In such moments, the soldier realized how fragile his rest truly was, always at the mercy of chance. Weather only deepened the weight of the night. Cold winds seeped through cloaks, turning sleep into a battle of shivers. Rain pelted tents or cloaks, dripping into bedding, soaking men through. Snow muffled sound, but its icy weight pressed against the body, leaving men numb and sleepless. In deserts, the night heat lingered, making even breathing feel heavy. Each environment turned the long night into its own trial, with sleep a prize won only through exhaustion. Still, there were rare moments when the night brought peace. A clear sky, cool air, and a quiet camp allowed soldiers to lie back and watch the stars. For some, the constellations became reminders of home, the same patterns seen by fathers and grandfathers. For others, the vastness of the heavens gave perspective, making their own struggles feel small. In these moments, the soldier's long night could be a time of calm, a fragile respite from war's constant demands. Picture such a night, a camp silent except for the steady crackle of embers. Soldiers lie sprawled on cloaks and straw, their breaths rising and falling in unison. One man lies awake, eyes on the stars, thoughts drifting to home. Another stirs, mutters in a dream, then falls silent again. At the camp's edge, a sentry paces, spear in hand, his steps steady against the stillness. The night stretches on, endless and quiet, until at last the first light of dawn creeps across the horizon. The soldiers rise, weary but alive, ready to march once more. The long night of the soldier was the great equalizer. Whether king or commoner, knight or footman, steppe rider or legionary, all faced the same darkness, the same fragile search for rest. In those hours, stripped of rank and armor, they were simply men, vulnerable, weary, and human. War might define their days, but the night reminded them of their shared need for sleep, for dreams, for the small hope that tomorrow would come. And so we come to the end of this long journey through the nights of ancient soldiers. We have walked with them across deserts, forests, and battlefields, watched them huddle under cloaks, lie upon straw or stone, and share warmth and stories by firelight. We have seen how they endured storms, hunger, fear, and exhaustion, and how even in the most hostile places they found small moments of peace. What emerges is a truth as old as humanity itself. No matter the age, no matter the army, every soldier was bound by the same need to rest. Sleep, fragile and uncertain, was the common thread that tied them together across centuries and cultures. When we think of war, we often imagine the clash of steel, the thunder of hooves, or the roar of voices in battle. But behind every charge and every victory lay the quiet hours of night, when men set aside their weapons, closed their eyes, and gave themselves over to the hope of dreams. Their struggles to find sleep remind us not only of their hardships, but of their humanity. In their nights, we glimpse ourselves, the same longing for rest, the same comfort in companionship, the same small rituals that help the mind find calm. If you've listened this far, I hope these stories of ancient knights have helped ease your own. Perhaps the rhythm of their lives has lulled you into rest, or perhaps you are still awake, gently carried along by the voices of history. Either way, I want to thank you for joining me in this quiet journey through time. Before we part, I invite you once again to subscribe to this channel, History for Sleep. By subscribing, you ensure that you will always have a place to return to when you want to drift into the past while drifting toward rest. And if you feel moved, leave a comment below. Share what moments of history most interest you, or tell us when you like to listen at night before bed, or during the day when you need a pause. Your words guide the stories we tell and help us shape new journeys for you. So now, as the soldiers once did, let us close our eyes and surrender to the night. May the quiet of their camps, the flicker of their fires, and the rhythm of their weary hearts carry you gently into sleep. And until we meet again, may the past continue to keep you company in the stillness of the dark.